Hello everybody, it's Rachel here at Clarity Hands Crafts. Today I'm going to be showing you how I've made the junk journal cover for my grunge junk journal, which is based around the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. It's my favourite poem. It's quite gothic and it's all about loss and death, so I thought I'd make it in a grungy style to reflect that. I know it doesn't sound very nice, but it's actually a really good poem. You should read it. So these straps have been made from some packaging material. It was this flat stuff, but it was kind of fluffy and fabricy. I couldn't let it go to waste. It was black, by the way. I don't know if that makes much of a difference, but I've layered over the top some of this hessian material on one piece and some Ada, you know, the cross-stitching stuff on the other one. That's that white one that you can see to the left of my hands there. So on this one with the hessian material, I've been doing some cross stitch but really badly, and it's reminiscent of Frankenstein style stitching, which is another kind of gothic novel from a similar kind of era, so I just thought that would translate quite nicely into this book. I dried and emptied some old tea bags and I've then split them, as you can see here, although I didn't empty them very well because look at that, there's a load of tea still in there. And then I tear pieces of it and stick it over the top of the Ada just to dull it down a little bit. I thought that white backing was a bit too bright and a bit too clean. I wanted some extra texture, so I decided to add the tea bag. Now I've used a glue stick. Now we all know that glue stick isn't the strongest adhesive that there is, but all I wanted was that to just hold slightly, because as you'll see in a moment, I stitch around the edge again with that nice black cotton, which makes it look all Frankenstein-y and like it's just been muddled together. My whole aim for this journal is texture, texture, texture. I just want texture everywhere, loads of different sensations when you touch it and when you look through it, and I want it to be like a work of art. So I'm just adding the tiniest of details at every opportunity. I am leaving no space blank. I just want the whole thing covered with visual interest and textural interest as well. So one thing that I do find really hard when I'm creating journals is I find that when I look back over them, they're very plain, they're very flat, they're very one-dimensional. So that is what I am trying to break out of with this project. You can fall into a rut quite easily with the same kind of thing. When you're used to making journals and you have a routine that works for you, you can become quite stuck with it. So this is me actively trying to change the way that I journal and expand my horizons, open my mind, and change the way that I do things so that my journals can become more like the ones that I really admire when I'm searching on Pinterest, when I'm having a look on YouTube. There are loads of things that I see and I'm like, why don't mine look as interesting as that? So that is what this journey is all about. And I'm using this nice grungy theme to explore the idea of it. I'm never quite sure whether to leave bits like this where I'm stitching slowly in, so I've sped it up a little bit for you so that you won't have to sit and watch it all, otherwise we'll be here all day, let's be honest. I really like the look of those tea bags. I've never used any tea bags in my work before. I've seen other people do it, but this is the first time I've tried. Now I drink tea like it's gone out of fashion. I never stop drinking tea, so I've always got an abundance of tea bags in my house. In fact, fun fact, for Valentine's Day, my partner got me 1,000 Earl Grey tea bags, so I will definitely be putting those to good use in my journals as well as drinking. Now, we don't really do much for Valentine's Day. We might get each other a little quirky gift, but that's about it, really. So when he walked in my house with this gigantic box for Valentine's Day, I thought, oh my goodness, I haven't bought him anything. I feel so bad. But then it turned out to be a massive box of tea bags. I mean, some people might not understand my love for tea, but he does, and that's the important thing. So I already had some mount board ready and prepared for the front and back cover. So this is mount board which has been covered with brown paper packaging from Amazon or some sort of delivery company, and I just basically wrapped the front of it, and that's all I did. And I did it really badly as well, but this is going to work out to make it even more grungy, and I am happy with that. This is the great thing about doing a grunge style journal. Everything goes. Nothing has to be neat and tidy. Nothing has to have a finished edge. It just all gets slapped on and mucked in, and it looks great. If it's visual interest that you're going for, then contrast is key. That's why I'm using this black paint to create a border around the edges of the front and back covers. When I added the paper, the brown packaging paper, I scrunched it up really tightly so that it would already have some background texture. As I say, I want to leave no surface untouched. I want everything to have something to look at and some interest, so that's why I did that. And by using a dry brush, that catches on some of those creases and enhances them even more. What you'll find is by doing a border like this, it will draw the viewer's eye further into the centre piece of the image. And that's what you should aim for with any piece of art. The viewer should not be left confused about where they're supposed to look. Their eye should naturally be guided to the correct place, and it should feel comfortable for them to look at it. So as you can see here, well, as I mentioned earlier, I haven't necessarily finished any edges, so I am using the black to just go over those very edges, the edges of the mount board as well. The mount board was very stark white, so I didn't want that look for my journal, so that's why I have darkened them down with that black. Now, I did say that the black was paint, but it's actually gesso, and I'm watering it down a little bit now because I'm going to do some paint splashes on the background as well, or some gesso splashes if you like. There are more efficient ways of doing this if you're not frightened of getting your hands dirty, but for somebody who's called clatty hands, I really don't get like getting paint on my hands. So I have just done it the hard way and been sitting flicking paint for ages, trying to get a good coverage. But if you use your thumb and a toothbrush, then you can get a splash effect much faster. But obviously don't use the toothbrush again for brushing your teeth after that. After a while, I decided to add some splashes to the straps as well. They didn't show up very well, but at least an effort was made to add some and tie them all together. And then I used my heat gun to dry it off. Then I got out my ink sprays. I think these are the Ranger Dilutions ones. Are they Dilutions? I can't remember. They might be Tim Holtz. I think I've got a mix of both. So I just sprayed some inks on there, and then I'm diluting it with a spray bottle of water to make it run, because sometimes those pigments can be quite harsh, and I wanted them to be a bit more blended and kind of spread out a little bit. So the raven that's on the right hand side there that you can see, I cut out on my Cricut machine, and I made the silhouette myself, so I just went over the top of a image of a raven and I just blacked it all out and made it into a silhouette so that it would just cut easily on my Cricut. Next I wanted to use some stenciling, so I wanted to use the modelling paste to do a 3D background. These tree shapes, it's a shame that they were not inverted, because if they had been, then it would have been the trees themselves that were sticking out rather than the background of the trees, and that wasn't going to work, so I decided on using this brick wall one instead. I used a plastic palette knife to apply it, and I always find that plastic ones are better than the metal palette knives because the plastic ones have a bit more give in them. They're a bit more flexible so that they can get into the nooks and crannies a little bit easier. So I applied that. There wasn't really enough of the modelling paste left in that tube, so I was kind of scrimping and saving a little bit because I wanted it to go further than what I had enough for. It was important that I used a lot more white on the background because I wanted it to have that contrast between the background and the raven itself. I wanted the raven to be the focal point, so I wanted that to be where your eye's drawn to. So the best way to do that would to be add more contrast with the background so that it really stands out. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, I really didn't enjoy doing this part because the stencil was dirty, so there was already kind of ridges all over it. It wasn't very smooth application. It was quite tricky, and that modelling paste as well, it wasn't just a normal modelling paste, I think it was called a texture paste, so it was really gritty as well, and it just wasn't going on very smoothly. But the end result of it didn't look too bad at all, so I'm glad I persevered with it. And that reminds me, I must throw out that tube because I've still got it in my kit and I'm going to be disappointed next time I try and use it. I did some of the stenciling on the back as well, and then I dried it out with my heat gun. And then I am using white, oh no, it's called Picket Fence, this white ink, and that is another Ranger one. So that was again to just help the crow or the raven pop out from the background a little bit more, to give some more separation between that and the background. The white spray ink is a bit harder to spray, it keeps clogging up easier, and I think it's because it's more of a paint spray than an ink spray. Obviously, to get the opacity, it would need to be more of a paint than an ink, so that's why it kept clogging up on me. Now I am adding some foam sticky pads. I can't remember what you call them. Yeah, whatever they are. I'm sticking those on so that again we're getting a little bit more dimension. I was slightly concerned that the edges of the raven would get bashed around a little bit if I've raised it up like this, but then I realised that I was going to do a frame around the outside and that'll probably protect it a little bit as well. So I decided to go for that because I really did want it to pop out from the page. So speaking of the frame, I'm going to get started on that now. And I'm using some calico fabric that I've had in my stash for ages. It always gets used for my junk journals, so I highly recommend that you have some of this in your stash. It's just like a really thick cotton, but it's a natural colour as well. It's like not bleached white or anything like that. It's really nice, and it looks good in most situations with your more old-fashioned junk journals. So what I'm doing here is I'm cutting a hole out from the centre of this piece that I've cut, and as you can see I haven't done it in a straight fashion. I am just keeping it raggy. That's the idea that I'm going for. I want it raggy and uneven and just looking really worn and used. That hole wasn't quite big enough, so then I've trimmed some more from the inside. We're creating a frame or an aperture to go around the raven, and I'm not worrying about the scissor marks. So you know when you chop and then you get kind of a raggy line, but I quite like that. So what I'm going to do is just stretch it out a little bit, and then it will soften up. Those edges will look more natural rather than something that's been done with a blade. I'm also pulling the edges as well to try and create some small tears. So as you can see, that little bit there is starting to roll over, and that's exactly what I want, because I'm going to be adding some detail with some more stitching around those edges, those inner edges of the aperture. And then at this point I realised that the outer edges were still too wide. They were going to overhang too much of the edges of the cover. So I'm trimming those down as well. I'm also making them slightly more oval rather than rectangle. Watching this back, I'm thinking, why on earth was I struggling on with those scissors? They're no good. I should have been using my fabric scissors, and that would have been a lot quicker and easier. But never mind, we work with what we've got on hand at the time, don't we? Otherwise we end up spending all of our time rummaging through supplies looking for things that we know exist, but we're just not quite sure where they are. So that went on for quite a while with me trimming bits off, and then I settled on this kind of rectangular shape, even though it's going to be covered up later on, as you'll see, but I just needed it to be the right size. Oh look, I'm still going, still trimming. It's like one of those haircuts where you try and balance things out and then you just end up chopping and chopping and chopping until one side is completely short. But I had an image in my head of what I wanted it to look like, and I persevered until it looked something like what I was expecting. So eventually it looked like this. I loved those torn bits at the top because that meant that it was going to reveal like a little curtain, and that is something that I had in mind. Now what you'll see me doing is adding some stitching, so I want more detail around these edges, and I'm going to do some Frankenstein stitching. That's what we'll call it, because it's that black thread on the contrasting background and it's not necessarily neat and tidy. Although saying that, this did turn out to be quite neat and tidy, and I didn't like it. So the edge of the fabric was nice and scruffy, but my stitching was a little bit too neat. So when it came to doing the other side of the curtain, I needed to make a change. You'll see what I did with that in a moment, because I did a row of straight stitch first up this side bit, and that was another part that had just folded back on itself, and I pinned it in place with a row of straight stitches just to give it that little bit more interest. And from where I cast on for that straight stitch, I have taken the cotton up to the second bit of the curtain. I'm just calling it the curtain, you know, the bit that folds upwards. That's what I'm doing now. So what I decided to do is, I think I did a couple of stitches to get it in the right position for where I wanted it. I might have done a little cross stitch just to add a little bit of extra decoration. And then I took the thread around. Hang on, let's just wait and see how I do it here. Right, so I'm starting to pin back that curtain, but instead of just doing a stitch where I stitch it back, I wrapped the cotton round so it came round the front of the, let's call it the curtain still, so it came round the front of the curtain and then into the fabric behind it. So what it ended up looking like was that there was a string holding it all back. Hang on, let me wait until we move a bit further on to see how that started to look. There we go. So you see, I'm not piercing from the back side. I am just raveling it. You know how if you've ever tried to teach a child to sew, they always do this, where they'll pierce it in from the front, but then they'll bring it around the edge. That's what I did there. And then it created this kind of cool ropey look. You see where it's much darker on the right hand side there, and I love the way that looked, and I'll definitely do that again in another project. So here I'm bringing in my aperture that was cut out of cardboard. I say cut, so that it was cut on the edges, but then I just tore the centre frame out there. So I had already made this, I did it off camera, and I measured it for size to see how it would look layered over the top of the fabric aperture, and guess what, it was the perfect fit. That doesn't happen very often. And then what I started to do was to peel off some of the front of the corrugated card because I wanted to expose the corrugation, if that's a word. So I'm just peeling it off, and I found it quite a struggle at first to get the texture that I wanted, but then I started to get the hang of it and started to realise which part I needed to tear. If anybody has any tips and tricks of how to do this more effectively, then please share, because it is really tricky to do. I don't know why I found it so hard, but I kept peeling off the corrugated layers as well, so it was just exposing plain card again from underneath. And then when I did this top bit here, it all tore away, so it went really flimsy, but thankfully it was still intact, so I managed to just stick that down and stop it from tearing any further. Not that it would be a bad thing to be torn, but it looked right as it was, and I didn't want it to do any more. There we go, we've got a lump of corrugated exposed there, and that's what I was hoping to do on all over the thing. It's one of those things that seems to happen naturally whenever you're tearing up cardboard, but whenever you try and do it on purpose, it just doesn't go like that. Anyway, once I was happy with the result, I inked around the edges with black ink, and this is archival ink, so it should be able to withstand people picking the journal up and things like that. And I went around the inside frame and the outside of the frame. And this reminds me of like coal houses and things like that, like coal dust, which would have been around in those Victorian periods that we're talking about here for the setting of the poem. I didn't stick down the cardboard frame just yet because, as you'll see later on, I do make a fastening attachment, and I wanted that to go between the layers. So I wanted that between the fabric layer and the cardboard layer, and I'll show you more of that later on, but it needed to be done at a later stage, as you'll see in how everything turns out. So now I have mixed some glue with water to make it go a bit further and to make it spread more easily, because I'm going to be sticking down tissue paper, so you don't need anything that's too strong and gloopy. The tissue paper is from an old sewing pattern that I had lying around, and I wanted to have raggy edges of it sticking out so that they can appear from the front. When you turn it over, I want the tissue paper to be poking out around those edges. So I just started slapping it on, any old how, leaving raggy edges all over the place and not worrying about whether it was down smoothly or anything like that. I did it for both the front cover and the back cover, and I left all of those edges hanging over. But what I did do is added extra glue to the very edges and just let that soak through so that it would bring some of the tissue paper more towards the front. I mentioned earlier that I used some packaging material that was like fabricy stuff, and that is it there in the black. That is the stuff that I used to make those spine straps. The black stuff is going to be used to line the inside of the journal covers, and that will cover some of the tissue paper, but the tissue paper will still be poking out of the sides. So the reason that I am doing the pocket now is I want to stitch it onto that black fabric. So I am making a pocket, and all I'm doing is folding the edges of a piece of card around something that I'm using as a template. So we'll just call that the journal card for now. I don't think I actually left that particular one in there, but it was just used to measure. So I'm folding the edges around. I've done the two sides and the bottom, and then what I'll do is open it out, and then I'm going to cut diagonally across the corners. Because this stuff is quite thick, it really needed burnishing down to make sure that it doesn't ping open or anything. Cutting the corners on a diagonal like this just ensures that when you lie all of the flaps down, that they don't overlap and cause unnecessary bulk. As I looked at it, I decided that I didn't like the black on black too much because it was too camouflaged, if you like. So what I'm doing here is just creating some little nicks with the scissors, and then that will allow me to start the tear like that. There we go. So I'm starting to tear the edge of the pocket, and what I liked about this card was that the core of the card was white, so when I tore it, it left that nice white border, and it just makes it pop a little bit more. And then I realised that I would need some whiteness around the edges, so all I did was use my scissors to scrape away the black ink and expose the white so that it would stand out a little bit more. You'll probably notice in a lot of my videos that I spend a lot of time just putting things in place and seeing how it looks, because that's how I work. I like to check things, make sure that it's coming together in the way that I want before I glue things into place particularly. So I was happy with the pocket once I'd done all of that distressing of the edges, and I decided I would glue it into position with some wet glue before stitching to give it extra security. I made sure to weigh it all down so that it wouldn't ping off, and then let it dry for a few minutes before I took it up to the sewing machine. So when I came back down, I arranged all of the journal cover pieces to see what it was going to look like. Now I used some fabric glue, and it was my first time using this glue, and I have never seen anything like it. It came out like, you know, I can't remember what you call it, the stuff that you use to seal the edge of baths and things like that. It goes waterproof. Yeah, it smelled like it as well, so I do actually think it's the same thing. But the nozzle was really strange. It had this little twirly thing on. I feel like I didn't use it right. It doesn't look very good, but it did stick it down. I thought fabric glue would be the best thing to do this, the Ada and the calico, not the calico, what do you call it? The Hessian fabric. But it did turn out to be nice and strong, so I think it was the correct choice. I just maybe wasn't using it in the most appropriate way. So once I'd had the glue on, my hand is being used as a measure there to make sure that the front cover doesn't take up too much space. And then I stuck that down on top of the straps. So it's worth mentioning that, there you go, I'm showing you. The black fabric hasn't been used yet, it's just been measured and stitched ready. So I am going to stick the straps down on top of the tissue, and then we're going to make a strap sandwich, if you like, with that black fabric stuff. I realised that it was a shame to waste the excess of the strap there, so I decided that I could use some of that to make a closure for the journal, and that's exactly what I did. I just trimmed down the excess, kept those pieces the same size, and then put them to one side for later on. And then I was able to use my lovely gloopy glue again to stick the back cover down onto the straps, leaving enough space for the binding. I did find that the tissue was getting in the way quite a lot, so I needed to trim that down before I stuck this into position. So I'm just going to trim that with the scissors, make it a little bit shorter on that side, or narrower if you like. Shorter is probably the wrong word to use. So yeah, I just took those off and then made the space and stuck the back cover down onto the straps. And I left about a 5cm gap between the two, between the front and the back cover. I haven't really considered how I'm going to do the binding stitches yet. I don't know if I'm going to be sewing through the fabric straps, or if I am going to be kind of wrapping something around them. I really don't know. I'm just going to kind of make that up as it goes along and hope for the very best. So now I can put the fabric pieces into position. Those black packaging fabrics, they can just be glued down over the top, and I did use more fabric glue for this because I wanted to make sure that it would stick thoroughly. And then when I glued it, I was able to press the fabric all around those straps to make sure that everything was sandwiched nice and securely, and it was kind of moulded together as best as I could. Because what I don't want to happen is to have the inside peeling off of the outside and just making an absolute mess. At this point, I decided that I needed to trim some of the tissue down because it was just a bit too unruly. It was kind of getting in the way and making things look a bit too bad. Yeah, just bad. It just looked bad. So then the next task was to make the closure using those scrap pieces that I saved from earlier on. So I needed to make sure that they were cut to the same size, and I didn't want them to be absolutely massive, so I did trim them down a little touch. If I'd have left them too big, then it would have distracted from the main character, which is the raven, so I trimmed them down, made them really quite a lot smaller. Now I'm just playing around with the placement, and then what I'm going to do is pierce these with eyelets. So I was marking out where I wanted the eyelets to go, and what they'll need to be is in line with each other. So I used my crocodile to cut the hole first on each of them, so then I could make sure that that was going to be in the right position. I put the eyelets in and then I crunched them down to make sure that they were nice and secure. I do use the eyelets that have the little backing piece so that they're nice and smooth to touch on both the front and the back side, so you don't get any kind of split metal or anything like that that causes problems and catches on the paper. I glued one to the front and one to the back, and I made sure that the eyelets were in line with each other, because what I'm going to do, I don't do it in this video, but what I'm going to do in a future video, I'm going to make a tie closure. So I'm going to use lots of different fabrics and strings and things like that to make a nice long strap that I can tie from the front to the back, but you'll see that another time. When I was finished gluing, I opened it out so that I could check that I was happy with the placement, and then I started to play around with the front. So this is where I decided to glue the fabric down, that calico fabric that's made a frame for the raven. I glued that with some glue gun glue. I thought that would be the best thing to use, but I think I also used a little bit of wet glue at the same time. I'm preparing the cardboard frame here as well, using those foam pads again, because they give us that 3D look, and when it's over the top of some rippled up fabric, it's going to find it quite hard to find a purchase if I just used a wet glue. So I used these foam pads and also some glue gun glue, possibly some wet glue as well, just to make sure it was absolutely secure. I thought I had some book plates somewhere in my stash, but I couldn't find them anywhere, so I decided to make my own. So I want to call the journal Nevermore, because in the poem that is what the raven repeats over and over again. And I decided to do that with some stickers, just letter stickers, and a piece of black card. And I actually really like the way that this turned out. The scrap of card turned out to be a little bit too big looking, so I just decided to rip that down and make it fit more perfectly. The torn edges turned out to look great, and they were really textured, and it was quite a thick card that I was using, so it really did stand out very well. And then after I had torn it down to size, I decided to use some little split pins. I think they're called split pins, brads maybe. I had some tiny ones, so I decided to pin that into position to make it look more like it was supposed to be there and more like an old-fashioned book. I love to use lots of metal embellishments in my junk journals, and I'm going to particularly pay a lot of attention to using metal in this one, because I think it adds to the age and the kind of industrialness of the time period, and I just think that it will make it look more interesting than a normal plain book. So there we have it, that's my grunge junk journal cover. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that I inspire you in some way, shape or form to do something similar.